we'll get that started. Let me share my screen here. All right, let me make sure that I can move the slides, which don't seem, there we go. Okay, so tonight we'll be talking about predators. If you have any questions during the course of the talk here, feel free to either write them in the chat or just hold them till the end. If it's something that's really pressing, you can just unmute yourself. We're a relatively small group, so it shouldn't get too chaotic in here. But otherwise, we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So tonight we'll be talking about predators. We'll be talking about what a predator is, their important role in the ecosystem, some of those predators that we live with every day, whether we see them or not, and then how we invite or welcome or don't want to welcome and sort of disinvite some of these predators from our close proximity and our backyards. All right, so first and foremost, what is a predator? At the most basic level, a predator is one organism that eats another organism. We'll be focusing for the most part on one animal eating another animal. And the real thing that differentiates here from, some sort of insect or maybe another plant that harasses another plant or maybe eats a leaf on it, something like herbivory, although herbivory, as we'll see, can be a form of predation, is that it causes the other organism to die versus just harming it in some way. So some typical characteristics are that predators are large and charismatic. They have larger home ranges and thus lower population densities because they are, with some overlap, not typically sharing those ranges with other individuals that could be competing. And they're great ecosystem health indicators. They are the proverbial canary in a coal mine, although instead of catching things early, they kind of give us an indication that something's been wrong for a long time because, say, for instance, with a toxin, if it bioaccumulates through the food web and up the food chain, by the time that we see an issue with a predator, that's because it has accumulated so much so in their system from so many prey individuals that they've consumed that there's some really large widespread issue, but they can be an indicator that there's something that we have to look for. So on the basic level, this is probably something that you've seen in every biology class. This is a really simplified food web. It differs from a food chain because a food chain is something very linear. So the food chain would be sort of the cat eats the bird and the fox eats the cat. A food web is better to look at because it gives us a more holistic view of ecosystem health. So this is giving you the chain of who eats who, but on the web level, it can help us because if you're looking at the chain, right? So the cat eats the bird, the fox eats the cat. If we imagine removing the cat, then it looks pretty catastrophic. Meanwhile, if we look at the food web, we see that that fox has other prey that they could be eating even in the absence of the cat. And that's important because in some instances, some, say, native predator, unlike the cat, could have a broader influence on ecosystem health if it was removed. But we know that the domestic cat is not a native predator and that that's actually something that ideally we would like to remove from the food web. We would like to keep all the cats indoors. So when you look at the food web, you get a sense that if you did remove the cat, that fox would be okay because it has other things to eat. So the Latka-Volterra model, let me admit someone. There we go. So the Latka-Volterra model is basically tells us about the predator-prey situation, right? It gives us an equation. It gives us a way to look at and model data in those multiple predator-prey interactions. There's a lot of information here, but right now we're just kind of focusing on what's labeled as B, where the axes are population size and time. And this is really typical between a predator and prey. What you see in this wave is you see this increase in prey population at a pretty severe angle. And that is because there might be an abundance of resources. If you have a relatively low population of prey, that means that there's a lot for them to eat because prey are the types of animals that we see in relatively high numbers, right? They reproduce a lot. There's a high turnover rate. We don't expect all of the individuals to survive. They have a pretty high rate of not making it through the first year, say. But then what we see at a certain point is it hits this carrying capacity. For whatever reason, potentially it maxes out on the resources available. the prey sees some drastic drop off. And part of the reason it's so drastic is that by the time the population is affected, that means that they are already above their carrying capacity. So their carrying capacity is somewhere below that peak that you see. But meanwhile, what's happening is once there's an abundance of prey, that predator population is quickly catching up, because if there's more prey, that's just more food for the predators. So we see them rapidly increasing in population behind them, but lagging behind what's happened to the prey as their population decreases. So similarly, through starvation, through smaller litter sizes, they're always going to be, the predator curve is going to be a little bit delayed behind the prey. And so that'll go on and on and on. And it seems to flux at a pretty severe angle, but really that's equilibrium for the ecosystem. We can't really have a linear line because that's just not how things work, but these average out to somewhere right in the middle that is steady over time. And so that is the ecosystem's equilibrium. And you will see this across almost all predator-prey interactions. And that's why it has a fancy name. This can also give us a clue if we're looking at data, if something's gone wrong or just something's affecting this interaction, say the introduction or the removal of either another prey or predator. In reality, it's going to look something more like what we're looking at in C, right? It's not going to look so pretty, but it still averages out to be a pretty steady line somewhere in the middle here. And what's extra interesting about this is really having this real data can give us a good hint at what's going on in the past, present, and future. So say, for instance, this 1864 area where there seems to have been an exceptionally large spike in the hare population. That could have been because there was a drought the year before, and now there's an abundance of regrowth and food and resources for that hare. Whatever that is, we can see potentially, we can project under those same conditions what might happen in the future. So if there's a lower year, see maybe 1905-ish, maybe we know there's a drought. So we have a much better idea if we see that same drought come along, what's going on. Now, another thing that happens when either prey or predator are at or above their carrying capacity is that they're much more susceptible to disease because there's just a much higher density, as we've seen, with COVID. The more people that you're around, the more individuals of your species where you have a transmissible disease, the more likely it is to spread and decrease that population over time. So that's the main sort of oversimplified way of how predator and prey interactions occur in an ecosystem. When we're talking about predators, though, they're not just a monolith. We have not only a huge variety of how they function within the ecosystem at the top levels, but we also have multiple levels of predators at different trophic levels. So a really important one are mesopredators. And you may have even seen articles talking about the rise of mesopredators in the last few decades. And that's for a few reasons. So first, what the difference is between sort of your apex predators and your mesopredators are how often they're acting as predators. So something like the gray wolf or the American black bear are going to be predators all the time, whether that means that they're actually taking down living prey and hunting them. It just means that the bulk of their diet is going to be coming from hunting in one way or another, whereas mesopredators tend to be generalists. They're usually a little bit smaller, their population's a little bit higher, they can use a wider variety of resources, their territory is a bit smaller, their home range, so they're more mobile and they're able to adapt to their situation a little bit better. So while that sounds great, it also means that they get bullied by these apex predators who are persistent predators. It's what they do all the time. But we as a human species, also an apex predator, have bullied the other apex predators over time and really bullied them out, aka we have killed them off in a lot of instances, or at least driven them almost to the point of extinction, or at least outside the boundaries of urbanized areas, even many rural areas. So what that's done was left this niche for these mesopredators to come in and fill and really act in a lot of ways as apex predators. It looks a little bit different, and we'll talk about that and some examples of what that is in a bit because their population is much higher. But we're really affecting things drastically. It's not unheard of. All kind of predators bully one another, and you have this hierarchy. So whereas humans, we might bully the black bears and the wolves, they in turn will bully the coyotes and the bobcats of the world. So if you have say, a kill site of an elk that a pack of wolves is taken down, if a coyote walks up there and tries to take it, they're not going to take too kindly to that. And the coyotes are really going to have to wait their turn until the wolves have gotten their complete fill, they've left it alone, and then the coyotes can come in and get the rest of it. If the coyote took down some prey, something smaller, say a squirrel, but you have a really hungry wolf that wants it, the wolf's going to come in, that coyote's going to drop it, and the wolf's going to get it, even though they're both predators. Even amongst your apex predators, you have this hierarchy. So out west, where you have wolves cohabitating with grizzly bears, if the wolves have something, that if that grizzly bear walks up, he's going to get what he wants. And so even though bears are apex predators, they're really, really lazy, right? It takes a lot of calories for them to do anything that they're doing. So they're much happier to not hunt directly, but to really take the carrion or the recently dead animal from someone else. Briefly, we'll touch on scavengers and herbivory in the context of predation, but really these guys could easily take up their own program. So with scavenging, it differs because that is when an animal is eating from a dead animal, so maybe roadkill, maybe something that another animal's already eaten but gotten their fill of and left the rest of it there. But where that overlaps is almost all scavengers, if they're hungry, will absolutely take and hunt prey. So there is a bit of overlap where they do act as predators with opportunistic hunting. A vulture almost will always scavenge, right? But if that vulture is really hungry and there's something small and moving, if it can get it, it'll take it. Similarly to what we talked about before with herbivory, as long as an animal is consuming the whole plant, then that is a form of predation. So that wouldn't be, say, like a white-tailed deer eating a sapling, even though they might eat enough of it that it harms it, that it can't grow. This is more like, say, a cow eating some of the herbage and foraging on the ground, where it's going to be consuming the whole plant. That is absolutely a form of predation. Okay, so a little bit of our special history with predators hyper-locally. So we used to, pre-1900, have apex predators around. I mean, we still have the bear, the black bear, and we still have the bald eagle, thankfully, but it was a long road to get here. And we've also lost some of our apex predators along the way. So first and foremost, the wolf. We didn't used to have coyotes here. We did used to have wolves here. Also the mountain lion or the cougar. They used to be the ones that were keeping the white-tailed deer population in check, and a lot of these other prey populations that have since been able to explode in check. And we've seen the effects of removing them from the population in terms of the explosion of some of those foraging animals that have just absolutely just decimated the understory of our forests. When you walk through a forested area, it shouldn't be so simple to just walk a straight line through your line of sight, A to B, like 100 meters away. There should be an entirety of understory there with secondary growth, with bushes and shrubs and all sorts of things that are in your way and are going to grab onto you as you try to walk by. But that's just not what we see when we go through a walk through the woods. Even if we don't stick to the trail, you know, we could just walk off any direction for the most part, any way that we want, and just head in a straight line. So these have long-lasting effects. With the wolves, we did not want to compete with them for livestock, similar to the mountain lion, right? So we effectively completely eradicated them from the area. With the eastern wolf, we did completely eradicate it. With the mountain lion, they do exist in other areas, although they're usually typically severely endangered still. There are some reports every so often of people seeing mountain lions in the Northeast, and especially in the Adirondacks and the Catskill Mountains. For the most part, all of those have been escapees when we've caught them on trail cams and things. It turns out that they came from a zoo. So we have not in a long time had any confirmed mountain lions in New York State that are reproducing here, unfortunately, although that would be lovely. So now, right before we go down our list and see how many we can get through of some of the exciting predators that we have around here and that you may or may not have seen, I'll share a story that I think most people have heard at this point, but it is a great example of both the impact of removing a predator, but also just the complexity of ecosystems and how just removing the predator is never the whole story about how something changes over time. So back to the wolf, right? Another very charismatic predator. When they were removed from Yellowstone National Park through hunting and effectively removed from the entirety of the lower 48, we saw a lot of changes. The most famous one is that now the elk population exploded and there was a decimation of the willow plants that the elk eat, right? Because there was nothing keeping the elk in check, so there's nothing stopping them from eating all of the willows across the entire area. And as the story goes, once the wolves were reintroduced, it not only caused the elk population to go down and therefore the willow were able to come back, but that had its own effects on the landscape and how the willow held the soil and thus affected the entire stream and the path of the rivers that flowed through the area. Now, it's a nice story, and it certainly was super impactful, but there were other changes over that same amount of time, such as like climate change and the changing of some species and invasives that came through that also had an effect. So that's one reason that it's really important to look at the entire food web and the entire system when you're talking about predators, because it can make for a great story to look at it super linearly up the food chain. But you want that entire look at how the ecosystem is trying to reach equilibrium over time. All right, so the American black bear. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of seeing one of these guys in person, but they're pretty spectacular. And we have them down here in Westchester County. We have them at Teatown. There is at least one fellow who last year, and I think has been seen again this year, has made his way through many a backyard and wreaked a bit of havoc along his way. So they'll live to about 18 years in the wild. And while they will go in our backyards, they certainly prefer the contiguous forest, bog, swamp, and the outreaches of agricultural areas. The one spot that you won't find them in New York State is in sort of the plateau area, the really agricultural heavy area, because there's just not enough food for them there for it to be worth it with the amount of human contact. And that edge habitat doesn't work as well for them as does contiguous forest. Their home range can vary widely depending on where they are. And you'll see this a lot. Typically the females will have a much smaller range and the males will go much further and they'll utilize much more area. The reason that they move further is they understand that they need to get away, not, on like they have a conversation with themselves sort of way, but genetically they understand that they need to move away from their family unit to avoid incest. So they'll move much further than the females will. The females will move a bit away from mom, but they might even overlap a little bit. Sometimes you'll see young male bears as they search for resources will overlap a bit. Similarly, you might think that the smaller home ranges would be in more urbanized areas, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they have to go even further in urbanized areas in order to locate the resources that they need. And what are those resources? Well, bears are omnivorous. They eat the grasses, berries, fruits, nuts, roots, and shoots, the insects and the grubs, any dead animals that they might find, as well as helping themselves to human sources of food, like corn, the things in your garden, honey, birdseed is a big one, and of course the trash that you might leave out. Birdseed is an absolute gold mine for the black bear. A sort of standard 1 foot tall cylindrical bird feeder can hold about 20,000 calories of bird seed. So you can see why the bear is going to spend his time to make sure that he gets it open, whether that means scaling a tree and crossing a line or whatever kind of thing that we put up as humans thinking that we're outsmarting the bear. That's 20,000 calories. That's huge. In the early part of the year after the winter, that's a couple days worth of food. And as you get closer to the winter when they're really bulking up, that means that that's a one-stop shop for about a day's worth of food, maybe a day and a half. So that's a huge find, and their noses are incredible. We're not sure exactly how far they can smell, but it's somewhere up to miles and miles away. So even just the remnants of birdseed left on the ground is something that's going to attract them. And if they don't find the birdseed because you've put that away, but you've left some bits and pieces on the ground, they might look around the rest of your yard to find out what's there. And really, they will find your bird feeders. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people where after the bear finally got to their bird feeder after their neighbors and the neighbors before theirs, they were still utterly surprised that the black bear was able to find their bird feeder and took the time to take it down from whatever contraption they've put together. This is really nutrient dense, easy meal for them. And again, bears are lazy animals. They're going to do the least work possible to get the most calories. So this is a big find for them. Next, my beloved eastern coyote. I could talk about him all day, but I will keep it to a minimum. His lifespan is widely varied. Typically, it would probably be about the same as a German Shepherd, so 12, 13 years, maybe 14 years. But we know that it's rough out there, especially for a mesopredator. Over here, again, they don't really have that apex predator coming from them, but they have all sorts of other things to worry about, like disease, like getting hit by cars, like competing with each other. So really we're looking at maybe 3-4 years, and the really older ones who are really smart, maybe we're looking closer to that 12-year mark, but typically we're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age. They're going to be looking for that edge habitat, those overgrown fields, the brushy thickets and the woodlands, somewhere where they can see and find their prey, but also stay hidden. So they want to be on the sidelines. They want to be able to take as straight of a line as possible. They want to be able to watch their surroundings and find out what's happening, but they also want to stay hidden. They don't want you to see them. And for the number of coyotes that we have around here, it's really incredible that we don't see them more often because they hide themselves so well, even when they're close by. Their home range is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of about 20 square miles, but again, that varies widely. Their favorites are small rodents, mice, voles, squirrels, sometimes groundhogs. Look at the birds, the insects. They'll also dig up the roots and shoots and berries, kind of whatever is available. Unfortunately, they do not, again, fulfill that apex predator role of being able to take down adult healthy deer. While they do have these sort of small family units, maybe 3-4 individuals that might stick together, they don't hunt in the same way that a wolf pack does. It's not that cohesive for the most part. So they aren't able to take down these larger ungulates. But what they can do is early in the year, they can absolutely take a fawn. Fawns aren't going anywhere too quickly, or perhaps an older but lame or diseased deer that's also not able to fend off the attack by an individual. They also will happily take the carrion, so like the deer that are hit by vehicles. Unfortunately, what this means often is that all of those opossums and raccoons and deer that get hit on the side of the road do attract the scavengers closer to the road. So whether that's vultures, whether that's hawks, whether those are coyotes, it all draws them much closer to the road and causes an even higher increase in wildlife vehicle collisions. And unfortunately, the insurance premiums also rise as a result. Here's one that we see a little bit less often. This is our bobcat. We are lucky to see the bobcat sometimes on our trail cams here at Teatown, although I haven't seen one myself anywhere around here because they are extremely elusive. And you'll see their home range can be significantly larger. Again, the females are going to have much smaller of a home range, whereas the males are going to go much further out. They also live a little bit longer. I'm not going to say it's because they're a little bit smarter, but it might be that they know how to stay out of the way. So they're going to live 5 to 15 years. Again, the first couple of years, really, really difficult for animals. It's really incredible for them to live past their first year. They're going to be looking for those larger forest patches, the wooded swamps, rocky outcrops, and occasionally agricultural areas because those are the areas that draw the mice and other parts of their diet. They're looking for the rabbits, the squirrels and the mice, maybe also the fawns and small deer, lame deer. Snakes, lizards, domestic animals, unfortunately, again, another reason to always keep cats inside is because once they're outside, they are now part of the food web, for better or for worse, whether that means that they're taking songbirds, the mice that you don't want in your barn or in your basement, and they're getting them outside. And unfortunately, it also puts them in the middle as a mesopredator to be predated upon themselves. Bobcats can be somewhat of a nuisance if you have livestock in terms of sheep and goats and your chickens and ducks. They're all fair game when they're outside. And while now, we have many more options available to us, whether that's through electric fencing or more lethal methods to get rid of these predators, in the past, you can understand why someone just wanted to be done with any competing predator when they were out in a farm with no way to deter them in any significant thing. Like no scarecrow is going to get a coyote or a bobcat or a wolf to leave. Fisher, another guy that we unfortunately don't see too often, but again, we have the luck of finding on our trail cams here at Teatown, sometimes called Fisher cats, but they are not actually related to cats. They're going to live about 7 years, although in captivity, they can live significantly longer, many times that. They're going to look for mature evergreen or deciduous or mixed forests, and they're looking at about 10 square miles and are going after, surprising to their size, rabbits, squirrels, raccoons, and opossums, but also the smaller guys, the reptiles, the amphibians, the frogs, and anything else that they can get their hands on. You'll see for a lot of these mid-range guys, these mesopredators, they'll eat almost anything that they can get their hands on, unless they're an obligate carnivore, something like the bobcat, where they have to solely eat meat. They will just pick and choose whatever is available throughout the year, and that's what makes them so successful, and that's why they tend to have higher populations. Great horned owl. So again, fortunately, unfortunately, we have the luck of having two great horned owls here as ambassador animals at Teatown. Their names are Aurora and Orion, and they're wonderful, and you can see them 365 days a year, dawn to dusk, on our raptor loop. But they're here because of wing injuries. I don't remember their exact stories, but often it is car collisions involved when they, again, are going for some sort of prey that's close to a road and they swoop down. But they're incredible. They're going to live about 13 years. They're looking for those edge habitats or those cleared forest floors where they're able to spot their prey with their incredible eyesight. So one thing that there's not much of in Westchester is meadow habitat. We have at Croton Point Park at the old landfill a significant amount, and there we're able to see quite a few songbirds, but the rest of the patches tend to be quite small. Even here at Cliffdale, we are working to expand our meadows that we have up the road because they're small. And when you have pretty small pack, just a couple, oh, here's someone coming in. When you have just a couple acres, short of maybe 10 acres, something smaller than that, it makes it really easy for the owls and the hawks to pick off their prey. And while that's great for them, it's not always great for the songbirds that also might be endangered or of special concern that are using this as a migratory route. So their home range is a bit smaller than something that we've been looking at, so 3 to 4 square miles, and about 90% of their meals are not necessarily those songbirds, but are the small rodents, the chipmunks, the gophers, the squirrels, the mice and the rats and the muskrats. Even because the great horned owl is on the larger side, the occasional raccoon or maybe the baby raccoon. They'll also go for snakes and lizards and frogs and insects, and of course, birds. Here's one that we definitely do see far more often, and that's the red fox. So this guy you might see playing in your backyard, pouncing in your backyard. He's a little bit more comfortable closer to our homes. Unfortunately, he has a very similar lifespan to another mesopredator, the opossum. So he's only around for about 2 to 5 years. Again, it's really hard out there for these animals to get through the winters with competing with each other. So they're looking for those overgrown fields, maybe your overgrown backyard, the brushy thickets, and the woodlands. The reason, while they're similar in size to coyotes, a bit smaller, that we see these guys, but we don't see the coyotes so close to home, is because the coyotes have taken their place a little bit higher on the totem pole, and they are acting as sort of the apex predator to the red foxes. So they're going to boss them around. So there's not any sort of wilderness really down in Westchester, but we do have certain areas that are further away from homes, maybe the power lines, maybe a little bit deeper into the woods on a preserve. And the coyotes are going to take that habitat. That's consequently going to push the red foxes a little bit closer into our yards. And so that's why we're going to see them a bit more, because as both of their populations are exploding, they're using up all the space that they have. So there are more and more studies being done about how their interactions work as two mesopredators. But what we do know is that the red foxes are getting pushed closer to our houses, and the coyotes are trying to fill in those leftover gaps in between that are a little bit far out. We probably know what the foxes eat, similar to everything else, those rodents and the rabbits, but they'll also go for the roots and the shoots and the berries and the fruit. And they'll also they're in the club of going through your garbage can once it's knocked over, or going, unfortunately, and maybe going for the chickens or the smaller game on the farm. Our friend, the raccoon, he is a predator indeed. He is a mesopredator. He is going to live about 2 to 3 years. This habitat, while it says forested areas near water, I think this is his best case scenario summer home, because as we all know, they are anywhere and everywhere around us. They are way too comfortable being close to us, and they have absolutely habituated to human activity and associate us with food very rapidly. As anyone has probably seen, when the parent raccoon brings its like squad of 5 little baby raccoons and shows them where the best trash can is. Because this is a good case study in how not to interact with wildlife. If anybody's been to, say, a campground, right, where there's plentiful food, there's a high turnover of people, so nobody's really taking the time to force them away, not only do they highly associate us with food, but they can get rather aggressive about it, which is a huge problem. When it's the size of a raccoon and you could feasibly, if it came up to you, I don't know, kick it away, that's not the same thing you're going to be able to do with all predators. You're not going to kick a bear away from you. So this brings up the point of hazing and keeping these predators or all wildlife at an arm's length. Whether we don't like them and we want to keep them away, or we love them a little bit too much and consider them a little too fuzzy, we need to remind ourselves that these are wild animals, and we're going to share our property, we're going to share our home range with them and cohabitate. We also don't want them right up in our business. So never have an issue hazing any sort of predator or wildlife. And what does that mean? Well, hazing is just any deterrent that you enact directly or indirectly with an animal to keep it away from kind of your home base. So what we don't mind is an animal using your property to traverse, say, between resources, right? That's totally fine. What we don't want is to associate you and your activities as a food source. So if you start to see an animal get a little bit too friendly with you, while it might be cute, we're going to tell it, we can yell at it, we can tell it to go away, we can throw a handful of gravel at it, we can make noise, we can get a shaker full of coins, we can spray water at it. Not recommended for at-home use, but some governmental agencies like the DEC or the Connecticut DEEP will use things on larger animals like, say, a beanbag gun to deter it, maybe even a paintball gun, because once an animal is habituated, it does become a danger to humans. Whether that means for us, maybe a smaller animal isn't going to be too bad of an attack, but it might carry diseases, that could be an issue, or a larger animal that you come around the corner and it's too close and it's afraid. It's a bear swat, even if it's not trying to seriously harm you, is going to do serious damage. And so some people might say, well, okay, if it gets too used to me, I'm sure that the DEP will come or the DEC will come and they'll pick it up and they'll put it somewhere else where it can have the range of a forest. It really does not work like that for the most part. The reason being sort of twofold. So the first reason is that if you put an animal somewhere else, it's already habituated, right? It already has those habits, and wherever you put it, it's going to display that same behavior. So if you move it to somebody else's neighborhood, it's going to do the same thing there. So that's a problem. Also, if you sometimes move an animal, it's going to try to return to its home range. Wherever you're dropping it is probably someone else's territory. So it's going to try to get back. And what that usually means is it's going to try to cross a bunch of roads and eventually get hit and die, or alternatively, it will not have access to the same resources and it will starve and die. So by the time an animal gets habituated, it's already sort of too late. So we want to catch it before that point so it doesn't have to be euthanized and become a danger and also potentially harm somebody. Thankfully, those instances are incredibly rare, but that's because we have to take that action to coexist and haze them ahead of time. If you ever need tips, there's a bunch on the DEC website, but basically it's going to be making noise, yelling, throwing small things at them, increasing intensity or just varying what it is. Something like a coyote is like your dog. It's an observational learner, so it's super smart. So if you yell at it a bunch of times, but it realizes like, oh, but then nothing happened, it's going to stop caring at the fourth or fifth time. So maybe you escalate to coins in a can. Maybe you spray it with a hose, something like that. Like anything that you might do to get a strange dog out of your yard will probably work in a similar manner. But generally, these animals don't want to be by humans. It's sort of a last resort to get food, as long as you aren't making it really like a buffet for them where it's that enticing. They want to stay wild. They're not really interested in being our best friends. So it's in both of our best interest to always keep them at an arm's length. All right, the last one that we're going to talk about today is our common snapping turtle. He is also a predator, so he's going to eat another animal. These guys live for a much longer time, 30 years. There's not much eating them once they get past their sort of really small baby stage. They're going to be living in ponds, wetlands, and adjacent upland habitat. Any wet adjacent area with a soft, sandy, or muddy bottom is going to be their habitat. And they're not sprinters. They're going to be staying in a relatively small area, about a half square mile or so. They'll be eating a lot of plant matter, insects, spiders, worms, fish, frogs, whatever kind of comes by while they're down there. Plant matter accounts for about a third of what they're eating. When they're small and they are much more agile, they will go after small fish and frogs. Once they're older and larger, like this mama here, she's going to kind of sit back and relax, burrow a little bit back into the mud and wait for the prey to come to her. Anyone who's seen a snapping turtle snap knows that they are really fast and efficient, and they will absolutely take off your finger. So they're, as long as something comes anywhere near them, they're going to get it. On that same note, we're all tempted when we see a turtle to help it across the road. So we'll just talk briefly about a few things we want to keep in mind when we're ever doing that, especially for a snapping turtle. So for any turtle that is not a snapping turtle, you can usually tell because they look like dinosaurs, the sandwich method is best. So you're just going to pick it up like it's a sandwich, put it always in the direction that it was already heading. So even if you think you kind of know better and you see a better spot for it, or you think, oh, I got a really nice pond by my house, don't do it. Just pick it up exactly where it is, head it in the same direction across the road as it was going, and leave it, and then wash your hands because they can carry salmonella, amongst other things. For a snapping turtle, it's a little bit different. The last thing in the world you want to do is hold it like a sandwich, because that neck can snap back to either side of its back about halfway down, or maybe a little bit more. So you don't want your hands anywhere near there because it's going to go through your finger like a little baby carrot. Another thing you don't want to do is lift it up by its tail. That tail is the extension of its spine. And if you lift it up by its tail, the weight of its body and its carapace there can actually sever the spine. So we never, ever, ever want to do that. So what can we do? Well, right at the back, right where its kind of butt is, you can, with one swift movement, again, no hesitation with these guys, you can lift, you can grab them right under there and lift just a little bit. They'll probably help you, again, in the direction that they were going by scooting their front limbs across, or at the very least, pick them up just so their head's just barely above the ground. In the case that you do drop them, they don't have very far to go. Now, if you're not strong enough to do that, but you still want to help out, there are other options. You can grab something like a floor mat from your car and get them on there, and then in the same direction that they were going, but maybe backwards while you drag them so you're not anywhere near their head, get them on there, and then drag them on the mat and release them again in the direction that they were going. If you are not comfortable moving a snapping turtle, that's okay. You don't have to. These guys are kind of, they're dinosaurs. They really can injure you. So we don't want anyone severing any fingers in the course of helping them across the road. You can also kind of offer them a stick to put in their mouths to keep them busy so that you have a little bit less to worry about. All right, now we're going to talk about our backyards. Oh, no, we got a little bit before our backyards. Okay, habitat fragmentation, right? This is a huge threat to our predators around here when they're looking for resources. So this is Croton locally. And while you might say to the right of the photo, why wouldn't something spend all of its time over there? There are a lot more trees, there are way fewer humans. That seems like where we should sort of keep our wildlife. Well, wildlife doesn't work that way, and its resources don't work that way. So it might need water from the river. It might have a shelter over there in that wooded area to the top left. And then maybe there's a really friendly neighborhood over down there where that green arrow is, where everybody leaves their garbage out, and that's where they're getting the bulk of their food. So they're going to have to travel between these resources, and that's going to mean crossing through backyards, going over streets. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the animal's like right up in your backyard. It just means that they need to develop these sort of semi-safe highways to get from one resource to another. Even in, this is an aerial shot of Teatown, it's much less fragmented for sure, right? There's a lot more trees, there's far fewer roads, far fewer people. What this map doesn't show though, is there are still a lot of human impacts. We have about 15 miles of hiking trails that are often full of people and their dogs, which highly affect the movement of wildlife. I've seen certainly a fox on the trails. I haven't seen much other wildlife unless you go out really early or maybe later in the day, because they do still tend to avoid the area because there are human and canine threats still. And still, this is a relatively small piece of land. As we saw, a lot of these predators require a much larger home range, right? And they're going to be using resources that are even further away. So while this might be a good habitat patch, they're still going to have to wander further out. And you see all the way on the right of the screen, we're already at the Taconic, right? A huge hurdle for them to get through. And as we know, a lot of animals don't. So this all has a great effect. What this means is that in urbanized areas, we know the predators are down here, something like a coyote, you know, the raccoons, even now the black bears. They are here, and this is going to be a permanent part of their habitat and their range. So what do? As conservation organizations, we put our heads together and we look at what are those really critical patches that we can preserve that can act as stepping stones for wildlife as they navigate through a more urbanized area. So say some animal uses the Teatown Preserve and then also makes its way over to, I don't know, maybe Ward Pound Ridge. We might, if we understand and we have the data to show that an animal is navigating through that area, maybe an animal of special concern that we want to protect, we might look at what are those critical parcels of land that we would ideally love to say put a conservation easement on, make sure that they are protected in perpetuity so that you have these stepping stones so that they can get there. So as they go, have to cross traffic, then they have a bit of reprieve where they can have other resources and water and shelter in between. But you at home probably can't affect that too much. So what can you do just in your backyard? You have to look at your backyard as habitat. The animals don't understand that your property line ends in one spot. They don't know why you put something over there. They don't know why they're not allowed to be in that corner. Your backyard is habitat. And while you might be tempted to make it wildlife habitat, and in a lot of ways that can be really good, maybe for pollinators, its best use is really as a highway and a transient area for these animals to be moving through and not sort of a home base or some area that they really rely on, unless you have a major water source or something that's really useful for them. So first is to look at your yard through the lens of an animal. So it can be looking for a few things, right? The first is food. So if this is a standard sort of yard, there are a number of food sources that they might have access to. What are those? A bunch of them. So first and foremost, your garden, whether you have a small fence around that, no fence around that, maybe an electric fence around that, that is food. It's a food for us, and that's why we have it there, and it's food for them. Compost pile. If you don't have the meats and the dairies and the fish and the oil, you're much less likely to attract animals, especially if you have it covered. But once an animal is in the area, if that food is readily at that point available, they will absolutely take advantage of it. Empty pet food bowl. So you feed your neighbor's cat that comes around, or you let your cat out or your dog out and you put their food there. And then maybe the animal eats all of it. Would you want to lick that plate after they eat all of it? No, because there's still residue in there. And that residue smells, and that residue will absolutely attract animals and predators to your yard. Bird feeders, right? We talked about is a big one. And while the bird feeder, best case scenario, just attracts those birds, we know the squirrels, probably mice, those animals that might not go after the bird seed. So right, coyote is probably not that interested. It might snack on some, but it's not coming there for the bird feeder. It will come there for the rodents underneath the bird feeder because those are its prey. So that's another reason to take it down from April to November-ish. Maybe you have some fruit trees in your backyard or some low bush blueberries, right? That's all food. And then your garbage bins up front are also food, of course. So that's one set. Next is water. When they look at your yard, do they see water? Something like your food pet water, right? Or your bird bath. Now, these are not going to draw predators or any sort of animal from like miles around to get to your bird bath by any means. But again, what does it do? It might draw the birds, it might draw the squirrels, it might draw the mice, and then in turn, those will draw the larger predators in. So I'm not saying take down your bird bath. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure there are much better water resources around, but it can give you an idea when you are looking around your backyard what it means in a resource level to the wildlife that share your area. Finally, they're looking for shelter. So wood and scrap piles are big for animals because these offer a lot of protection and camouflage. They're usually relatively untouched for a longer period of time, and usually sort of in the corner of a yard. So they're pretty close to maybe a food source and a water source, but they're still out of the way. So something you might want to do is knock it every, once a week, twice a week, go in there and move some stuff around. Keep it neat so that there's not the nooks and crannies for these animals to get into, because it's a great den site for something like a hibernating bear or a coyote who's about to have some pups. And maybe worst of all, you don't want to come into the pile to find out that another mesopredator, the skunk, has made it a home, much to your surprise. So going around knocking it. Something like underneath the shed or your porch as well. You want to make sure that you're going in and you're patching all of those areas. People have absolutely had black bears come and hibernate underneath their porch because it was a small, relatively protected area. For anyone that doesn't know where bears might hibernate, it's not just in these perfect caves. Actually, caves can often be too cold for them. It can be up in a tree, it can be below your deck. Sometimes they'll even just lay out in the middle of the forest and let the snow fall on top of them as a large lump. So they're looking for any sort of shelter. Similarly, of course, more of a transient shelter would be something like bushes and trees that they can hide in as they go through, which leads us to our final point, which is movement, right? So we talked about movement. Movement's okay. We don't mind movement. Like we looked at with the Croton area or even with the Teatown area. To get between resources, they're going to have to move through yards. And so that's okay. We just want to encourage them to keep moving. So things like fences can really hinder that movement and cause them to look for alternate routes, which might not be ideal for us. So depending on the type of fence or barrier that you have at the edge of your property, it can really get any sort of animal prey or predator stuck the same way a sort of median in the middle of the highway can. And it will alter their movements, it gets them confused, and you don't want that situation going on. And it really makes their life much harder because it might force them, in this case, much closer to the road where they're ultimately probably more likely to get hit or involved in a vehicle collision. Also, an animal that's been hit by a car, if it's injured, can also become aggressive, right? They're fearful in that moment. So we don't want to produce those instances. Now, a driveway during the summer, I have that circled, and it really is not notable most times of the year. But in the winter, maybe we have a foot of snow on the ground, and what do we clear? We clear our driveway. So path of least resistance for a lot of animals will be those areas and those walkways that we've conveniently cleared for them. So I'm not going to blame a coyote if it comes closer to my house during the time of year where we have this really convenient highway, but that doesn't mean that we also don't haze them. But looking at your yard through the lens of these animals and the wildlife that are using it will help us better understand also what is a threat and what is not a threat. So a coyote walking super close to your house during the summer is not great, right? Because we don't want to accidentally come around the corner of our house with our dog and end up in a confrontational situation. We want to encourage them to move further away. But if you did see one during the winter when they're following the path of least resistance, we want to encourage it to use a different path, but we might better understand that this is not a similar situation. They're just trying to move through using the fewest calories possible. So again, those waste bins at the end, the best thing is to put them out morning of course. All right, we are just heading to 8 now. And with that, I will open it up for questions. So again, please reach out to me whether you have a question now or you have a question later and you want to go over it. This is also another predator, our friend the barred owl. We have Nova and Kajika here at Teatown, who I also encourage you to come and say hi to. and stare at their eyes. They are really spectacular animals. Specifically, owls have a number of features as a predator that are just spectacular. With predators, we typically do see these incredible sensory features, whether they have these large noses for smelling, or they have these very large eyes to see incredibly well, or these huge claws, much larger teeth and canines. They're pretty spectacular. So let me stop sharing here and open it up for any questions. Let me see if I have any in the chat. Oh, thank you, Michelle. And if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to unmute yourself. All right. Well, of course, reach out if you have anything else. I will send out this recording to you soon. And I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining tonight.
Thank you.